Oh, hello, ladies and gents. I don't know if you can see me, but anyway, we're going to move on. We're on the module A225, Block 2, Confident and Crisis, 1840s, 1880, edited by Loftus. I'm assuming that we're live. It says we're live, so anyway, moving on. Unit 14, Politics and People. Looking at the table, 14.1 lays out the major changes between the Liberal proposals of 1866 and the Act passed by the Conservatives the following year. It shows terms on which people were given the vote and which areas gained greater representation, urban boroughs or rural counties. The effects of Tory measure were greatest in urban areas, especially industrial towns such as Manchester, Leeds, and Murphy, Tideville. In particular, extension of the suffrage to all adult male ratepayers was a considerable concession. The changes to country franchise, though they went further than Gladstone's proposals, remained relatively modest. Because the suffrage threshold, land property value remained higher than that in the boroughs. With the abolition of compounding, Disraeli's Act brought in many new voters, 500,000 more than originally forecast. It inducted far more of working class into political citizenship than Gladstone has emphasised, and historians have attempted to define the motives for its radicalism. Was this a far-sighted attempt to create a Tory democracy in which the respectable working class man would lend his vote to a more openly patriotic and social reform-minded conservative party in preference to the Liberals? Was it a bad to shore up Tory votes in the counties? Or was it perhaps merely a clever, if optimistic, parliamentary views designed to offend Gladstone? It is likely that none of these reasons alone accounts for the Act's dramatic changes. I will turn to some of these questions in the next section. Why was the Reform Act passed? Needless to say, the reasons for the Reform Act passing have excited controversy among historians. To simplify, one interpretation is often associated with Asa Briggs, The Age of Improvement 1959. Depicted in 1967 as a natural progressive movement occurring within an environment of longer term social and economic changes such as increasing urbanisation and the emergence of new model unions. Thus, legislators, animated by a principal concern for the national good, plus moral and political pressures from below, extended formal citizenship rights, symbolically represented by voting, to a working and those privileged. For Briggs, it was primarily the spread of measure, of liberal ideas stimulated by the context which underlay the reform. Maurice Cowlin, 1967, presented the act of resulting from an often critical party political calculation that was broadly insulated from extra parliamentary reform agitation. Disraeli and Derby, motivated largely by an animosity towards Gladstone and a desire to shore up the Tory votes nationally, while simultaneously embarrassing Liberals engaged in manoeuvres that ended with far more democratic legislation than they had initially intended. Thank you for joining in. I can't see even the screen, so hopefully you can see on page 360. Thus, historiographical positions acquire labels of convenience that hark back to the period that they choose to investigate. Briggs' view was supposedly Whiggish. Cowlin's Tories, such as black and white terms, those served to distort the debate, turning that they were essentially a difference on emphasis into a key disagreement. Briggs did not shrink from examining the parliamentary mechanisations that surrounded Gladstone's failure to secure reform and Disraeli's success. Nor did Cowling maintain in Westminster, which was sealed off from the public agitation and a climate of ideas in Craig 2010. That said, both historians did concentrate principally on the motives and the sections of a relatively small group of people, subsequent scholars sometimes called new political historians, such as Robert Saunders 2011, Christian Zimmerman 2003, and Keith McClelland 2000, has sought to widen the compass of research to explore the politics, ideas, and influence of the country-wide reform movement and the interaction with parliamentary elites. To access the different factors that shaped the 1867 Act passage, let's examine the first pressure on the legislator that emanated from the country, and then the high political causes. In the first year and a half of its existence from 1865, the Reform League's demonstration and marches grew in size, echoing the organisational form of Chartism, though shorn of its more violent manifestations, mindful of the way in which 1848 was still apprehended by the political class. The League was careful not to endorse, still less to encourage, anything other than orderly protest that posed no immediate hazard to the public order. It was a weight of numbers, twinned with the length of the moral case, that reformers believed would deliver the vote. Beyond giving heart to the radicals in liberal ranks, most historians had considered that the League's impact on parliamentary politics was small before the collapse of the Russell-Gladstone Bill in mid-1866. The failure triggered an event known as a Hyde Park riot, where police denied a huge Reform League march entry to the park, in which a mass protest meeting had been planned. Undeterred, some of the marchers tore down sections of its railings and occupied the park regardless. Whether this event demonstrated genuine revolutionary potential on the part of the frustrated working class is doubtful, nor generally did the parliamentary elite recognise it as a prelude to the national uprising. Nevertheless, it raised serious order question and, with mass protests continuing into the winter, probably contributed to an atmosphere in which formerly antagonised parliamentarians began from the necessity to seriously consider reform in Matching 2001. Page 361. Following Saunders 2011, we should differentiate between the likelihood of reform in the mid-1860s and the measure eventually passed. It is difficult to see the Act itself as a product of politicians responding fearfully to extra parliamentary action. Westminster's party choreography seems far more significant. However, that does not mean that popular agitation was unimportant. Here it is important to distinguish between the burst of impatient protest in 1866 to 67 and a prolonged crusade to manufacture a moral case for the independent working man's enfranchisement. If anything, the latter was more decisive, since it created both an environment in which some variety of reform becomes steadily more likely, regardless of which party held power, and a system of nationwide organisation to agitate for it. We should not forget either the ideas of national interest and social stability, nor least a desire to avoid yielding full manhood democracy where important in politicians' calculations. Paradoxically, the country-wide campaign for limited enfranchisement on the basis of moral virtue was perhaps too successful. If its stated aim thereby become more likely, the old Chartism demand from universal manhood suffrage was as remote in 1867 as it was in 1848. only a handful of MPs wanted every adult male to have the vote, and neither Gladstone nor Disraeli ever risked going that far for. It seemed likely that Conservatives hoped to gain certain party advantages from their reform package. I have already mentioned, for example, that a country franchise where Tory support was strongest was set at a much higher level than for the boroughs. Seat retribution and expansion of borough boundaries seemingly created a buffer zone around the counties, which indicates that the government was thinking less about Disraeli's vision of Tory democracy. At that point, anyhow, a vague notion and more about shoring up Conservative votes in their heartlands. Jenkins, 1996. But if Disraeli hoped that the public gratitude at the reform would deliver the 1866 general election to the Conservatives, he has to be disappointed since the major issue in contest was instead the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland, and the result was a victory for Gladstone Liberals. Though franchise reform as a political issue was rapidly in the aftermath of 1867, the consequences of legislation and the debates that enveloped it were durable. They greatly conditioned public policies outside the narrow realm of Westminster. Is it that phenomenon to which I will return in section 14.2? Parliamentary reform in Scotland and Ireland. This unit has focused on the impact of the Reform Act of 1867 for England and Wales, as had been the case with the Reform Act of 1832, as you may recall from the unit Imagine Nations Made Real. In Unit 6, in Block 1, different laws were passed in 1868 to reform the representative systems of Scotland and Ireland. Taking its population into account, Scotland had been significantly underrepresented in Parliament. Even after 1832, the Representation of the People Scotland Act of 1868 addressed this imbalance by creating 7 additional seats for Scotland in the House of Commons, bringing the country's overall total to 60 seats. 7 small English constituencies and were disenfranchised to facilitate exchange, which meant that the overall number of seats in this House of Commons remained unchanged, although the number of Scottish seats had increased. The country remained underrepresented in Parliament after 1868 by approximately 8 seats. McCord and Purdue, 2007. In terms of redefining voting qualifications, the Scottish Reform Act contains similar provisions to that of England and Wales, although the precise details differed somewhat. The Scottish Reform Act also had a significant impact on the side of the electorate, which more than doubled from approximately 105,000 to 240,000. Mitchell, 2011. The Representation of the People in Ireland Act of 1868 did not alter the number of parliamentary seats returned for Ireland, so Ireland continued to underrepresented in Westminster. More important reforms had taken place quite some time earlier. In response to population decline as a result of the Irish famine of the 1840s, the Irish Franchise Act of 1850 had granted the right to vote to occupiers rather than freeholders or leaseholders of property valued at £12 in the country of constituencies and £8 in borough constituencies. These changes had seen the Irish electorate triple in size. In contrast, the Reform Act of 1858 did not change the county franchise. Although the debatable valuation in borough constituencies was reduced to £4, the measure saw the Irish electorate increase from approximately 197 to 225. Mitchell, 2011. A very modest increase in comparison was the rest of the United Kingdom. Page 364. 14.2, the impact of 1867. In section 14.1, I examined the reform movement and 1867 Act largely through the lens of democracy as manifested in formal national sense through voting rights in a narrow sense. There is little doubt that the Reform Act of 1867 made England and Wales more democratic. However, historians such as Patrick Joyce and James Vernon have suggested that British politics may become less democratic as it becomes more formal and organised. Think back to democratic as it becomes more formal and organised. Think back to Excise 14.3 and the discussion of Victorian ideas about domestic rights. Older forms of politics were generally public, whether hustings, petitioning, or localised protests such as based bread riots. Ostensibly, anyone, women or paupers included, could participate in them, and whether or not they had the vote. Over time, though, the politics were taken off the streets. Partly that was the consequence of increasing literacy, which meant that some politics could be consumed through newspapers and pamphlets read in the home, in the library, or in the club's meeting rooms. Partially, it was about the organisation of the political meetings in civic halls and meeting rooms, which had a limited capacity and often had the issue tickets for entry. Also, you'll see it was brought about the state intervention, found in 1993. I would like you to bear these arguments in mind as you do go on to explore some of the consequences of the Reform Act. Class public order and secret ballot. Admitting so many urban working class men to political citizenship made politicians anxious about the administration of open elections and the public order threats that might result. You'll recall from Unit 6 that both candidate nomination and voting were public spectacles, which attracted large crowds, usually consisting of a preponderance of non-electors. These affairs were frequently rowdy and violent, that the 1868 general election produced a crop of stories about mob rule, intimidation, destruction of property, and in one case murder, influenced the incoming Liberal administration to create a cross-party select committee to inquire into the running of elections. It asked to offer suggestions to improve their moral conduct and render them less dangerous to public order. Lawrence, 2009. Page 365. In the extract of Select Committee Report on Parliamentary and municipal elections in 1870, located at the end of the unit, consider some questions: which sort of practice did the committee find to be widespread at the elections? What remedy did it suggest and why? The report's core findings were that corruption, intimidation, bribery, violence and drunkenness were present at many elections, reminding MPs of fears triggered by the extension of franchise. And subtext may have been the urban working class, were particularly susceptible to those tendencies. You might also have noticed that the report's comments in Irish elections and the danger of spiritual intimidation. Therein, insinuation, the popular English, the phantom of Catholic influence over politics, Irish politics. The committee's principal suggestions to combat malpractice and violence was the introduction of secret voting. The report's language is revealing, however, the state anxieties over public order in an age of greater democracy. Hence, the ballot would promote the freedom, tranquility and purity of the electoral process, so as long as the secrecy of the vote was unavoidable. You might have picked up this exercise some evidence to support the arguments made by the Joyce and Vernon. The state was slowly moving towards the intervention in conduct elections by making them private rather than communal matters that required ending the public spectacle of opening voting in order to make those processes more bureaucratic and ordered. What the committee purpose was literally to take electoral politics off the streets. The unruly election of 1868 might have persuaded Parliament that voting had become more corrupt and disorderly with the advent of expanded franchise. But recent historical opinion had queried that notion. John Lawrence has argued that.